America did not always have immigration and customs enforcement. In fact, for the vast majority of the nation's history, the federal agency that Americans now associate with immigration raids, detention centers, and deportation operations simply did not exist. The question that investigators and historians continue to ask is straightforward. When exactly did immigration enforcement transform from a loosely managed system of labor and newcomers into a powerful federal law enforcement apparatus deeply intertwined with national security concerns? To fully understand that dramatic transformation, it is necessary to examine the very beginning of the American Republic. When the framers drafted the United States Constitution in 1787, immigration was notably absent from the document. There was no federal immigration agency. There were no visa requirements. There were no green cards or permanent residency documents. There were no border patrol checkpoints of the kind that exist across the country today. For nearly the first century of the nation's existence, immigration remained largely unregulated at the federal level. Individual states handled port inspections according to their own standards. Local officials made decisions about who could enter their communities. The federal government played virtually no role in determining who could arrive on American shores, who could remain in the country, or who should face removal. There was, however, one significant exception during the early years of the Republic. In 1798, during a period of heightened diplomatic tensions with France, Congress enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. These controversial laws granted the president authority to detain or deport non-citizens during wartime. This represented one of the first occasions when the federal government asserted direct power over immigrants residing in the country. Yet, even this early intervention was temporary and sparked considerable political controversy. The legislation did not establish a permanent enforcement agency. It did not create a nationwide deportation infrastructure. The measures reflected political anxiety during a fragile period of the young republic rather than a sustained policy commitment. For decades following that episode, immigration into the United States remained relatively unrestricted. Millions of Irish immigrants fled famine conditions and sought new opportunities in America. German immigrants arrived in enormous numbers. Other European populations followed similar patterns throughout the 19th century. There were no federal caps on immigration numbers. There were no quota systems restricting entry by nationality. There was no centralized immigration police force patrolling communities. The prevailing expectation was remarkably simple. If a person arrived on American shores and appeared healthy enough to contribute labor, that individual would almost certainly gain admission. That permissive approach began to change dramatically after the Civil War concluded. The question of federal authority had been fiercely contested in the decades preceding the conflict, particularly because of the institution of slavery. If Congress claimed broad power to regulate the movement of people across state lines, that authority might have interfered with the domestic slave trade and the property claims of slaveholders. After the Civil War definitively resolved the question of federal supremacy over state governments, Congress gained considerably greater freedom to assert national control over immigration matters. In 1882, Congress passed two landmark pieces of legislation that fundamentally altered the immigration landscape. The first was the Immigration Act of 1882, which authorized federal officials to exclude certain individuals considered undesirable from entering the country. This category included people suffering from contagious diseases and those deemed likely to become a public charge requiring government assistance. The second measure, enacted that same year, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law specifically targeted Chinese laborers and marked the first major federal statute restricting immigration based explicitly on race and national origin. This represented a decisive turning point in American immigration history. Immigration was no longer simply about welcoming labor to fuel economic growth. It had become a matter of deciding which populations did not belong within American borders. In 1891, the federal government established the Office of the Superintendent of Immigration. This represented the first centralized federal immigration agency in American history. The initial staff was remarkably small, consisting of only a handful of employees. Nevertheless, the creation of this office represented a fundamental shift in governmental responsibility. Immigration enforcement had officially become a federal undertaking. Ellis Island opened its doors in 1892 and rapidly became the primary gateway for immigrants entering through the port of New York. Between 1892 and 1924, approximately 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States seeking new lives. Roughly 12 million of those newcomers passed through the processing facilities at Ellis Island. Despite the new federal laws governing admission, exclusion rates remained remarkably low during this period. Only approximately 1 to 2% of European immigrants were ultimately denied entry. The borders were not heavily militarized. Passports were not yet universally required for international travel. Immigration enforcement during this era remained fundamentally administrative rather than militarized in character. The genuine transformation began during the early 20th century. Following the conclusion of World War I, widespread anxiety spread across the United States. There were mounting concerns about political radicalism imported from Europe. There was deep uncertainty about economic stability. There was considerable apprehension about rapid cultural change reshaping American society. Lawmakers responded to these anxieties with sweeping new immigration restrictions. The Immigration Act of 1924 established strict national origin quotas that dramatically limited arrivals. These quotas were calculated based on the 1890 census and heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western European nations, while severely restricting immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration from Asian countries was effectively banned entirely. For the first time in its history, the United States deliberately shifted from being a nation with relatively open borders to one with intentionally closed doors. Numerical caps became the governing norm. Border control became systematic and organized. Immigration enforcement expanded substantially. In 1933, immigration enforcement functions were reorganized into a new entity called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, commonly known by its initials INS. This agency combined immigration enforcement responsibilities with naturalization services for those seeking citizenship. The INS remained the primary federal immigration agency for approximately 70 years. In 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a consequential administrative decision. He transferred the INS from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice. That bureaucratic move signaled another major shift in how the government conceptualized immigration. Immigration was no longer viewed primarily as a labor market issue. It was now treated as a matter of law enforcement and national security. During World War II, the INS played a central role in detaining and interning individuals classified as enemy aliens. Nearly 32,000 German, Italian, and Japanese non-citizens were detained during the conflict. The agency operated dozens of detention camps across the country. Immigration enforcement had become deeply and permanently tied to national security concerns. Meanwhile, Latin America occupied a unique position within the emerging immigration policy framework. The quota system established in the 1920s did not apply to countries located in the Western Hemisphere. Agricultural businesses throughout the American Southwest relied heavily on Mexican labor to harvest crops and maintain operations. During World War II, severe labor shortages led to the establishment of the Bracero program. This initiative allowed millions of Mexican workers to enter the United States legally on temporary labor contracts. However, alongside this legal migration channel, unauthorized migration increased substantially. In 1954, the federal government launched an initiative called Operation Wetback. This massive deportation campaign targeted undocumented Mexican immigrants throughout the Southwest. The operation employed military-style tactics and resulted in the removal of hundreds of thousands of individuals. Some historical estimates suggest the total exceeded 1 million people. This campaign marked one of the largest deportation efforts in American history. By the 1960s, immigration policy shifted direction once again. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 eliminated the national origin quotas that had governed admissions for 4 decades. The new law prioritized family reunification and skilled labor as the primary criteria for admission. The legislation was widely characterized as a civil rights reform measure. It removed explicitly race-based restrictions and fundamentally reshaped the demographic future of the United States. However, while the law opened doors in certain respects, it also established the groundwork for new challenges. Immigration from Latin America and Asia increased significantly in the following decades. As undocumented immigration became more visible in American communities, public debate intensified considerably. During the 1970s and 1980s, the INS expanded its enforcement efforts substantially. The agency's budget grew dramatically during this period. Immigration was increasingly framed as a criminal justice issue rather than an administrative matter. The war on drugs and broader tough-on-crime policies of that era reinforced the emerging view that immigration enforcement belonged within a law enforcement framework. By 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act introduced new penalties for employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers. The same legislation granted amnesty to certain undocumented immigrants who had resided in the country for extended periods. The INS was now clearly operating as a criminal justice agency with extensive enforcement powers. Then came September 11th, 2001. The terrorist attacks on that date fundamentally transformed the way the United States viewed immigration and border security. All 19 hijackers were non-citizens who had entered the country through legal channels, but subsequently overstayed their visas or exploited weaknesses in the immigration processing system. Immigration enforcement became inseparable from national security policy in the aftermath. In 2002, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was officially established as a new cabinet-level agency. The INS was formally dissolved after 7 decades of operation. Its functions were divided among 3 newly created agencies. United States Citizenship and Immigration Services assumed responsibility for processing benefits and naturalization applications. United States Customs and Border Protection took over border enforcement operations, and United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known by its initials ICE, was established as the primary interior enforcement agency. This was the moment when everything fundamentally changed. ICE was not merely a rebranding of the former INS under a different name. It was structurally and philosophically different. The new agency was placed inside a department specifically constructed around counterterrorism missions. ICE combined immigration enforcement with customs investigations in a single organizational structure. It was explicitly designed as a law enforcement body with national security responsibilities at its core. Unlike earlier immigration agencies that balanced enforcement with service functions, ICE focused heavily on investigation, detention, and removal operations. The agency inherited existing detention facilities and subsequently expanded interior enforcement operations across the country. ICE coordinated closely with federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in unprecedented ways. The budget figures reflected this dramatic transformation. In 1975, the INS budget totaled approximately $181 million. By 2003, funding exceeded $6 billion. Under the Department of Homeland Security framework, enforcement funding continued growing substantially. When ICE officials referred to a functional history extending back more than 200 years, they are referencing a specific interpretation of institutional continuity. The claim acknowledges that while the agency itself was created in 2003, The federal government has exercised various immigration enforcement powers in different forms since the late 18th century. There were deportations conducted under the Alien and Sedition Acts. There were exclusion laws enacted in the 1880s. There were detention camps operated during World War II. There were mass deportation campaigns executed in the 1950s. However, the institutional structure that Americans recognize today as ICE is unquestionably a product of the post-September 11th era. Before 2003, immigration enforcement was housed within agencies that simultaneously handled naturalization and immigrant benefits. After 2003, enforcement functions were deliberately separated and placed within a Homeland Security framework. The organizational mission became more explicitly tied to counterterrorism objectives, criminal investigation activities, and interior enforcement operations. The change occurred gradually over many decades, but the ultimate turning point was unmistakable. Immigration enforcement evolved through distinct phases. It progressed from minimal federal oversight during the early republic to administrative screening procedures at ports of entry during the late 19th century, to quota-based restriction during the 1920s, to national security detention during World War II, to large-scale interior enforcement during the War on Drugs era, and finally, to the post-September 11th Homeland Security model. Today, ICE operates as a federal law enforcement agency with broad authority to investigate immigration violations, conduct worksite enforcement operations, detain non-citizens, and execute removal orders. It functions as a distinct entity separate from agencies that process immigration benefits and citizenship applications. The transformation occurred when immigration was fundamentally redefined from a labor and demographic issue into a security and enforcement priority. It happened in stages across American history. The change accelerated after the Civil War allowed federal authority to expand nationally. It intensified after the 1924 quotas deliberately closed the doors. It deepened after 1940, moved immigration functions into the Department of Justice. It demonstrated its scale after 1954 revealed the reach of deportation campaigns. It continued after the 1980s criminalized additional aspects of immigration enforcement. And most dramatically, it culminated after September 11th, when the nation fundamentally reorganized its entire security infrastructure. America did not always have ICE. For most of its history, immigration enforcement remained limited in scope, decentralized in administration, and frequently secondary to economic needs and labor demands. The creation of ICE marked the culmination of more than 2 centuries of evolving policy, political debate, and shifting national priorities. Understanding this historical timeline matters considerably, especially for citizens attempting to comprehend contemporary immigration headlines. Policies that appear permanent are frequently the result of relatively recent decisions. Agencies that seem foundational may actually be products of specific historical moments and political circumstances. The story of immigration enforcement in the United States does not follow a straight line. It represents a series of responses to war, economic demand, political fear, and demographic change. ICE represents the latest chapter in that extended history, not its origin point. And as history consistently demonstrates, government structures can and do change over time. The institutions Americans know today were shaped by specific events that forced lawmakers to reconsider how the nation manages its borders and protects its security interests. America did not begin with ICE. The nation arrived at this point gradually, step by step, through centuries of transformation and adaptation.